Coffee in hand, badge ready, you step into a familiar silence. Whispers drift between offices. Faces are pale. Before you can hang out your coat, the news. Several colleagues are gone. Again. At first you rationalize it. An illness, a coincidence, something ordinary, but the pattern repeats. Day after day. The air in the building shifts. The routine no longer feels routine. Welcome to the McConey case. What you are seeing here is Cabsworth in the southeast of England. The town has just over 1100,000 inhabitants, a university and several companies that have set up there that provide jobs for the people. This nice little town, however, harbors a secret. It's about defense, technology and a series of scientists who have suffered a sudden attack of death there. These deaths were so bizarre that at some point people started to take notice, and when research began it turned out that from a single company, 25 scientists had died in the strangest ways, and those are only the documented cases. The dark figures is allegedly much higher. How can there be a dark figure? Many of the scientists employed there came from abroad and at some point left the company and returned to their home countries, for example India, and tracking them down there is a little bit more difficult. Not being able to find someone anymore doesn't automatically mean the person is dead. However, with what happened in this matter, for some people that is beyond question. So there are 25 officially documented deaths of scientists, and according to what has been researched and who could no longer be found, there's this vague figure that speaks of thousands of deaths. But 25 deaths are enough to raise a certain suspicion. And this suspicion is directed against the British government, against the American government, against the intelligence services and against the company Marconi. Between 1982 and 1919 there was a series of strange and often gruesome deaths among scientists and computer experts working in the British high-tech defense industry. Pictured here is the headquarters, the company seat of Marconi. The people who died over the course of these years mainly worked at Marconi or worked for companies that carried out certain projects for Marconi. Many of these deaths at the time were so strange that the forensic pathologists could not determine the cause of death. In some cases it at least appeared as if there was evidence that the opposite was the case, but they were then declared suicides. At some point, of course, all these deaths under these strange circumstances became a topic on conversation. In 1987 the national and international press took notice. The first articles appeared asking whether these deaths could be sabotaged by foreign intelligence services or whether the government itself might be behind it. There were other theories as well, because Marconi also had a microbiology department where they developed biological weapons, and these biological weapons are of course particularly insidious and above all easy to use. A little pot of such an agent left somewhere in the underground and the city is contaminated. From this circumstance, a theory developed that many consider responsible for all these deaths. How do you prevent an enemy state from obtaining information about the development of a certain weapon if many scientists have worked on it? Just imagine these scientists being kidnapped by a hostile government and forced to produce this weapon. Or one of these scientists want to earn some extra money and sell his knowledge about this weapon to an enemy government. So how do you effectively prevent this secret knowledge from falling into the wrong hands? You have to get rid of everyone who has knowledge of this weapon and how it's made. This is one of the theories about these many deaths. A journalist from the British computer newspaper Computer Weekly named Tony Collins received the first hints about the strange deaths as early as the mid-1980s. He then started researching and identified these 25 deaths, some of which we will discuss in a moment. In 1990 he wrote a book about the matter. According to his investigations, there was some kind of conspiracy to which the scientists fell victim. However, he could not draw any conclusion about its true nature, why the whole thing happened, because to work at Marconi, everything that was developed there was extremely secret. At the time, Marconi was the largest British high-tech arms company, and the development area at Dr. Keith Bowden worked. One evening after attending a social event in London, Keith Bowden was driving his car along a wide two-lane road. There his car suddenly went over the edge of a bridge and fell into the depths. He was dead instantly. After a forensic pathologist examined a blood sample from him and the police reconstructed the accident, they came to the conclusion that Bowden had been heavily drunk. The problem was that Bowden had been with friends at a social event and they said he had not drunk any alcohol at all. Bowden had spent the evening with lemonade, cola and juice and had not consumed no alcohol. Bowden's lawyer, instructed by his family, hired an accident investigator who examined the wreckage of the vehicle, and he found out that the tires on Bowden's vehicle had been swapped. The tires previously on the vehicle were new, and there's even a receipt from a garage that fitted these tires, but now the vehicle had old worn tires. However, there were no new investigations. Authorities stuck to the conclusion that Bowden had been intoxicated and lost control of his vehicle. 3 years later, a radar developer named Roger Hill shot himself in his house with a shotgun. It's completely unknown why he would have done that. In the same year, a scientist named Jonathan Walsh died. He fell from his hotel room window. A radar developer who, like all the ones I mentioned before, worked on a secret project. It was Vimal Dajibai. He had been out celebrating with friends, was in the best of moods, and they had even made plans for the next day. And on the way home, he allegedly jumped off the suspension bridge in Bristol. However, the way he was found was very strange. He had pulled his trousers down to his ankles, and during the autopsy, a needle-sized puncture mark was found on his butt. Subsequent blood tests, however, yielded no results, and the forensic pathologist said he found this disturbing. A very strange death occurred just 2 months later and concerned a computer scientist named Ashad Sharif, who programmed satellite guidance systems at Marconi. Sharif drove his Audi to a public park, near the site of Vimal Dajibai's earlier death. He tied a thick wire noose around the tree branch and the other end around his neck, got into his car, accelerated at high speed, resulting in his decapitation. An iron bar was found jammed against the accelerator pedal, positioned so precisely between the seat and the pedal that it kept the accelerator fully depressed, even after he slammed forward. No motive for suicide was evident. Colleagues described him as a stable person. The forensic pathologist who investigated this case had previously investigated the case of the scientist who jumped off the bridge and had this needle-sized puncture mark that was also in Bristol. The forensic pathologist who investigated both cases refused to close these cases with a result because it all seemed very strange to him. Many years later, the journalist who wrote this book found out that both men had been working on an underwater guidance system for torpedoes. In 1987, Richard Pook, also a computer expert in the defense industry and a consultant to the Ministry of Defense, was found dead in his flat. His feet were tied and his body was bound with a thick cord, and he had a plastic bag over his head. The forensic pathologist concluded that it was an accident due to sexual misadventure. Just a few days later, a scientist named Dr. John Britton, who at the time was working with the Ministry of Defense on a top-secret development on behalf of Marconi, died. He got a carbon monoxide poisoning in his own garage. The Marconi engineer David Skills also died of carbon monoxide poisoning. His car was found with a hose from the exhaust into the interior. This was of course declared suicide. No known reasons for this were known to either the family or friends. In the same month, 2 more scientists died. One of them was Victor Moore, who died of an overdose despite never having had any involvement with drugs before. His family insisted that they would have sworn he had never taken drugs in his life. A scientist named Peter Peebles also died of a carbon monoxide poisoning. He and his wife had been at a party where the mood was very good, and they had enjoyed themselves. After the party they drove home and went into the house. His wife, feeling very tired, said she wanted to go to bed. Peter said he would put the car in the garage and then come inside. She fell asleep, and the next morning she found her husband dead in the garage. In this case, the police did not assume suicide because the position in which he was found was so strange that they said no person would sit in a car like that. Unfortunately, there is no description of the exact position, but it must have been a very odd one. The forensic pathologist stated that he could not determine whether it was suicide or murder. A particularly strange case is that of John Whiteman, a scientist at Marconi who was also involved in the development of top-secret weapon systems. He drowned in his tub, and when his body was found, it was surrounded by pills and empty alcohol bottles. However, the autopsy revealed no traces of medicine, drugs, or alcohol in his body, yet it was ruled as suicide. Shortly afterwards, it hit a man named David Sand, a senior scientist who worked at Marconi's subsidiary on behalf of Marconi on the development of computer-controlled radar equipment. He pulled off a very special stunt, to put it casually. First of all, it was of course suicide. He was driving along a road and suddenly made a U-turn and raced at high speed into an empty coffee shop. His vehicle exploded, and interestingly he had the whole boot full of petrol canisters. Petrol canisters that the family couldn't even say where they came from because they didn't own any such petrol canister. In any case, there was a huge explosion, and afterwards he could only be identified by the dental records. Shortly afterwards, a scientist named Mark Wisner was found with a plastic bag over his head and cling film covering his face. Here too his death was determined to be the result of a sexual mishap. The company Marconi at some point bought an arms company called Blesses. Within 1 month between May and June 1988, two scientists died there. Their names were Michael Baker and Frank Jennings. Baker was 22 and Frank Jennings was 60. The exact cause of death could not be determined. Shortly afterwards, a laboratory technician named Russell Smith, 23 years old, jumped from one of those famous cliffs in Cornwall. A senior computer engineer named Trevor Knight followed next. He too was found in his vehicle with a hose from the exhaust into the interior, and the family has no explanation as to why and for what reason he would have done that. Alistair Beckham was 50 years old and was a computer engineer and worked on a top-secret pilot program for the US Strategic Defense Initiative, which was initiated by Ronald Reagan at the time against the Soviet Union. Of course, in development at Marconi. Alistair went out into his garden one Sunday to do some light gardening in the afternoon. After finishing, he went into the tool shed, took an electric cable, cut it, stripped the wires and then placed them on his chest at heart level. He then put a handkerchief in his mouth and then plugged the cable in. That was the end of him. His wife was far from convinced that he had committed suicide. And then comes the strange part. After Beckham was found dead, men from the Ministry of Defense suddenly arrived and searched for the woman's flat. No police officer were present, only these men, and they also searched the tool shed and took several items with them. The Marconi director John Ferry died in a very similar way. However, he put an extra twist on it. He also took an electric cable, stripped it, and then placed the bare wires on his dental fillings before plugging it in. Everything you have heard so far has been classified either as a suicide or as an unexplained death. And ever since, the question has lingered in the air. Would someone really kill themselves in such a cruel way? Were they all suicides, accidents, or cases where the cause of death simply couldn't be determined? Or was it perhaps the KGB? Several MPs and a trade union leader Clive Jenkins called for an investigation into these deaths. In an article, Jenkins said these deaths were statistically completely implausible, and he wrote, "Our members are concerned about this accumulation of suicides, violent deaths or murders. The then Conservative government of Margaret Thatcher rejected this demand." The statement was that these deaths were statistically not unusual at all, but simply coincidences that might be exacerbated by the high level of stress in the arms industry. A quote from a press article. The British government, Marconi and many in the press blamed stress in the high-pressure arms industry for the cluster of suicides. Stress was often cited as a problem in the secretive arms industry and could not be a factor that contributed to the cluster of suicides. Suicide is one of the most common causes of death among men aged 20 to 49. Almost all the Marconi scientists who died fell into the age group. It would therefore not be unexpected for there to be a large number of suicides in a male-dominated profession, especially one that works under such strict secrecy. Added to this was the fact that these men were not allowed to talk about their work and so couldn't consult their relatives if problem arose. That was the explanation given by Marconi and the British government. There are also a whole series of expert opinions about the way these suicides were committed. There are psychologists who say that this type of suicide with electric cable is usually only committed by people who have psychological problems so severe that they could no longer go to work at all. Those who chose this type of death in quotation marks were still employed in this case and obviously had no problems, so there are the different opinions that clash. By the way, the company Marconi no longer exists. It was bought by BAE Systems, also an arms company. Of course, there are gigantic speculations and theories around this whole case as to what all the reasons could be why these people had to die or indeed took their own lives. All these theories basically boil down to the fact that they wanted to silence them. The fact is that 4 of these men who died had resigned and wanted to move to another company. The question now is, can one say they were all pumped off because they knew something or weren't allowed to tell something? That this was clearly the government and its company, or can one say what the government gave as an explanation? That with the stress and all these things, it's not to be dismissed out of hand either. Could it have been a mixture that some of these men committed suicide, but others were murdered? The numerically striking death toll amongst them remains undeniable. If you like, feel free to add your thoughts in the comments. If you want to see another interesting video of mine, I recommend checking out the case of David Crowley, who died while working on a film that depicted an uprising against the government. See you next time.